I woke up at 4 a.m. to drive across Hawaii's Big Island, headed for a steel boat packed with strangers and bound for a front row seat to one of nature's most dramatic performances. After an increasingly rough ride along the island's shore, we arrived to a smoky, steam-shrouded stretch of ocean where molten lava poured into the sea. Watching lava meet the ocean is an unforgettable experience. The vivid reds and oranges of the molten rock as it cools on contact, the sizzle and roar of the water, the thick plumes of steam rising into the air. It's an unmistakable display of nature's power. The heat from the lava flow had even warmed the surrounding ocean water nearly 20 degrees, drawing in sea turtles who came to lounge in the unusually warm water. As if being thrown around by the ocean in a tin boat wasn't nauseating enough, as the lava hit the water, it released hydrogen sulfide into the air. You've probably smelled it before, like rotten eggs, but it was more intense here than I'd ever experienced. Another 5 minutes in the area, and I likely would have been sick. Our boat turned and headed back to harbor. My neighbors and I reflected on the humbling experience of watching nature at her most violent, and how this experience had deepened our connection with this unique island. At the time, this natural phenomenon was contained within Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, posing no threat to human populations. But it doesn't take much of a shift for something beautiful and fascinating to become a catastrophic natural disaster. This week, our guest shares her own encounters with natural disasters and how these experiences have deepened her connection to the natural world.
Welcome to Conservation Connection, the show where we do just that, connect you to people working in the field of conservation. I'm Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And this is our show.
So Chance, my question for you this week is, what is your favorite memory from when you came out to visit me in Hawaii all the way back in 2016 and we went and walked to the lava flow that was happening on the Big Island then?
Oh, specifically from like when we went to go see the lava flow?
Yes.
Because not specifically, it's probably driving around in the Jeep listening to Toothbrush. I don't know why that's like my strongest memory. Not strongest memory. It was a good memory from that trip. From the lava flow, I think probably the hike back in the dark and seeing the stars. Mm-hmm. We went out to go see the lava flow because it was hitting the ocean, which doesn't always happen. The flow is strong enough that it was actually making its way all the way to the coast. And so we went out to go hike and see it. But it looks coolest in the dark. So we went out kind of at the end of the day and we're hiking back in the dark and just stopping in the middle of a lava field and looking up and seeing the skies above me was really a very powerful memory.
Yeah, I think we even laid down on the ground to watch the stars for a minute.
Probably. That sounds like us. We've laid down to marvel at nature several times in several places.
Yeah, that's fair.
I didn't really realize that's a thing that we do, but now that I think about it, we do that more often than I anticipated.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to take time to connect with nature, and you can't always do that just standing still.
What's your favorite memory from that whole experience?
I think my favorite memory was that we were walking for what felt like forever. I'm pretty sure that we meant to get there earlier in the day and just didn't get there early enough.
I think we got lost on the way there. Didn't we have to stop for directions? It feels like we had to stop for directions.
Maybe to find specifically where we needed to park within the park. So we're walking, it got dark. We didn't want to have our flashlights or headlamps on the entire time. So we were like, okay, we'll eventually find where this flow is and where we need to be observing the flow. And a ways into that, I'm like, okay, surely we're getting close. When are we going to be there? How much longer do you think? And I basically fall into this hard mountain of a rock from where the flow had previously passed. It's all cool and everything. I was perfectly fine. But I basically tripped into the lava flow.
Yeah, didn't you get a sizable divot on your shin? Because literally we were walking in the dark and then we run into what is effectively boulders that have flowed across the trail.
Yeah, maybe.
Good times.
Mm-hmm.
Worth it.
Yeah, definitely. So if you haven't guessed it, we do talk about volcanoes in this episode, so you'll get to hear more about that, but we don't want to spoil the fun. In this week's episode, we talk with Dr. Deborah Brosnan, who is an ocean scientist, founder of Deborah Brosnan and Associates, and co-founder of OceanShot. So this is a very ocean-related episode.
Some of my favorite episodes are ocean episodes. I really enjoy these. But first off, Dr. Brosnan has some incredible things to say and has some really cool insights into building a relationship with nature. But also, she's Irish, so she's got an amazing accent. There's just something about a cool story told in a cool accent that adds this extra je ne sais quoi to it.
Yeah, it always makes it a little bit better.
This is another episode that we got the chance to record this summer in Sun Valley, Idaho at the Sun Valley Forum. We had a great time out there. We always do. This was actually our third year recording with them. And I just highly recommend anybody who has the opportunity to get out there or even to just be part of their online live streams, do it. It is such a cool experience of listening and learning from futurists and people who are working to protect the planet. It happens every summer.
Yeah, and as we mentioned at the top of the show, Deborah Brosnan has some amazing stories to tell about her connection with the natural environment, how that's been strengthened over the years, how she found her passion for the ocean, and all of the amazing work that she does. So we cannot wait for you to hear this episode.
I really like how she talks about what we can learn from nature and how we can fold that into not just our personal lives, but into business, into politics, into everything.
Right. And how can we lift up other businesses that are doing great work without recreating the wheel? And how can we all work together and collaborate?
And so with that, enjoy this interview with Dr. Deborah Brosnan.
I want to start by talking a little bit about what is OceanShot.
So OceanShot is, in a nutshell, restoring coral reefs to scale, and not just the corals, but the reef structures. Because the secret, the magic to coral reefs, is that these corals create a large structure that provides biodiversity, habitat for so many species, fisheries. It's what protects our coastline from a storm surge. And so OceanShot is really about restoring these reef structures, creating biodiversity and ecosystem services like protection of the coastline, but then creating opportunities for things like AI technology to look at how do we monitor these reefs and ways that we may be able to speed up the restoration and scale them to areas that maybe can't actually afford or can't find a way to restore their reefs, so take it broader. And that's what it's about. It's something I started with John Paul DeJoria, and we started it in Antigua and Barbuda because we saw that only 2% of the coral was alive and the rest was dead. And when corals die, the reefs degrade and they collapse. So we also saw that these beaches were losing sand at an incredible rate. So the question was, how do we solve that problem? And we know that this isn't the only area in the world that's having it. We know we have to do it elsewhere. So that's how we started.
And in Barbuda, one of their main exports is sand, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Historically, one of the main ways to get income to the island was to export sand because the sand is coral sand and it's beautiful and it's a wonderful grain. So that was exported to other islands for everything from construction to some beach renourishment. So the consequence of that is that many of the dunes, these extraordinary dunes, got reduced in some cases down to sea level, which made the coastline more vulnerable to storm surge, which we saw after Irma. But I think this brings home, too, that for many island nations, often they have to overutilize or sell some of their natural resources because that's the only way to get income. The goal really now is to turn that around and to put value on those natural resources as they are. And so the value comes back to the areas that have them.
And especially now that we can see, this is the demonstrated effect of the loss of these ecosystems, right? Your increase in the damage from storms and from just natural wave action, the loss of economic opportunity because there's not as much fish available to be caught, the loss of the ability to forage for your own food and sustain your own family by catching food or eating what's on the island. As those things get degraded because of the overutilization of resources, it becomes really, really clear that we need to start valuing those resources, not just for what we could sell them for, but also for what all of these other ecosystem services that they do for the people that live on these islands.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. It isn't really Well, it isn't just about ecosystems for conservation. As someone said to me once, it's not a Trojan horse to conservation. These ecosystems are the original technology that humans have used. And protecting these and advancing and restoring these technologies is really what it's about. And what we need to recognize is that around the world for thousands of years, humans have used technology, and that technology has been nature and natural ecosystems. And we've got to bring this back into the public view. We've got to get the value for it recognized, and then we have to keep doing it and advancing it. And our challenge is to bring it into the modern world, not to forget about it, but to make it modern and to scale it.
Thinking about nature as technology and as something that we should value and learn how to use in a way that doesn't degrade it for future generations, I think is the only way for humanity to move forward into the future.
I totally agree. Absolutely. And that's what we have to do more and do better of. And thank you for starting to get that message out. It's important. And your point is exactly right about nature being the original technology that we have to think about for many benefits. And most communities that live close to nature, whether they're close to the ocean or close to the mountains or the forest, understand that nature is the technology. And they've been using it. They've been using it for thousands of years. Our job is to now recognize that and leverage it and bring it out into the public and make it mainstream. Make it mainstream. That's where we have to go.
So I know there are a few different coral kind of research and restoration organizations. Can you dive in, pun intended, a little bit more to what's the difference between OceanShot and these other orgs that are trying to replant coral and the ecosystems around them?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of very good organizations. Coral Vita is one. There's the Oceanographic group down in Monaco that are really focusing on coral species. How do we make corals resilient? Coral Vita is basically working on growing resilient corals on land that you can then transplant out. They're focused on the corals themselves, the coral species. And they're doing an amazing job. And we need to support those efforts, particularly the ones that we can scale a lot more than we are. They're focusing on coral species. We're focusing on the architecture of the reef. So we are providing, if you like, the habitat that it may take hundreds, thousands of years for corals to build, so that we're in effect an insurance policy. We're creating that architectural structure for the reefs, and we can plant living corals on that and then allow those corals to grow. So our hope is that we will be able to work with and leverage the work of the groups that are doing coral restoration, and that they can use our reef structures to get things going. So it's a complementary effort.
Mm-hmm. Two sides of the same coin. That's
exactly.
Really cool.
You need both. Yeah. And the work they're doing is amazing.
Yeah.
We don't need to start doing it. They're so good at it.
Right. Why reinvent the wheel?
Yeah.
Yeah. Solve a different problem and then work together. Bring the solutions together.
Exactly.
And that's one of the things, I mean, you hear this all the time in biological science, that structure brings life, right? So having some physically complex structures provides nooks and crannies for little things to hide, which means that there's food for slightly bigger things, which means that there's enough food for even bigger fish there. So just having the structure available is a great anchor point for biodiversity to start coming back into some of these ravaged underwater landscapes, right?
Absolutely. And I think it brings us a different message too, which is, if you look at what does this form do, this structure, it provides habitat, it provides space for biodiversity. And what it brings out is how nature is cooperative, that these coral structures provide habitat, that habitat in turn provides food for other species, and that ecosystem is interdependent and interconnected. And if you look at some of the ways that we have thought about nature and we think about how we run our world, it's about competition, right? Survival of the fittest. Well, it's survival of the fittest. The fittest is often the type of species that works in an ecosystem, in a community of ecosystems. And it is a model for biodiversity, and it is a model for resilience. That collaboration, that cooperation, that interdependence that we see in nature is a model that we should be bringing into our own world, into our business world, into our political world. This win-lose approach is not actually the most sustainable one going forward. Nature, again, being our teacher.
Yeah. when I'm cooking or doing stuff around the house, a lot of times I'll just throw on an old Disney movie or whatever. And last week we put on The Lion King. And there's that opening scene where Mufasa is sitting with Simba as a cub and explaining the circle of life. And Simba's like, but we eat the antelopes, right? And he's like, well, yeah, but when we die, our bodies go into the soil and become grass, and the antelopes eat the grass. So we are all connected. And even relationships that seem adversarial really are not. They're all about balance and about working in coordination with each other so that all of life can thrive. And I absolutely agree with you that that is the nugget of wisdom that we need to bring into our modern life, our politics, our economics, in order to live sustainably on this planet.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. It's clear that you have a love for the ocean. I want to know, where did that love for the ocean start? Was it at a young age, or did it happen later in life for you?
No, it started as a child. So I grew up in the west of Ireland and spent all of my summers in Kilkee. My family would go down to the coast for 3 months. And from as long as I can remember, I would wake up in the morning, and even if nobody was awake, I would find a way out of the house and just go and spend my time exploring the tide pools. And literally in the water, in the tide pools, all day, every day. And that really got me interested. At first, I really fell in love with the ocean, but it made me curious as well, because there's so much going on in tide pools. There's fish, there's periwinkles, everybody's doing something, or every species is doing something. And that did two things. It gave me a sense of belonging, to nature, because I was there, part of it. And then it also drove my curiosity to discover, to ask questions, and to find out what was going on. Being close to nature is the most important. And I also think nature saved me from a life of delinquency, so to speak, because it kept me so interested and so engaged. And I started reading. And I think the best thing we can do for kids is to provide them with spaces where they can explore, particularly in nature, because that's how you feel part of nature.
I think one of the things that's come up as we've been speaking with you in preparation for this interview and stuff is how much you value a relationship with nature. That as an individual, you should have a personal connection to the outside world. Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the really intense stories that you've experienced in nature, natural phenomenon, that have deepened your connection with nature?
Yes, to me, nature is both my teacher, my healer, and my connection. And we've talked about it as a child, but there's two particular instances. One was when I was scuba diving in Montserrat doing a volcanic eruption. We were looking at the coral reefs, and there was a nearby volcano that was active, and it blew up on me when I was underwater. And that's the reason that I'm still here, is that I was underwater, and we had all scuba equipment. And literally it was 1 PM. The volcano erupted. It was a pyroclastic flow, a bit like a Mount St. Helens eruption, huge ash that came down on top of me underwater. And literally when I came to the surface, there was burning vegetation everywhere. The top of the ocean was on fire. Wow. And what I learned from that afterwards was, first of all, some corals were very good at cleaning themselves off from the volcanic eruption. But more than that, it was what happened with the community afterwards. Because now they had lost the main port, they had lost the town, and we had to work with them to find a way to redevelop their infrastructure. And we did it in a place up north on the island, and as part of that, it became clear that the reefs were the source of fisheries, the source of food. And we moved a coral reef out of the way of a jetty that they had to build. And it really brought home to me how powerful nature is, the connection with nature, and how working with nature really, really helps.
So while you were diving, you said you knew it was an active volcano. Did you have any indication like, oh, this volcano may erupt soon? So that's one question. And then also, how far out from the island were you?
So we didn't have an idea that it was going to erupt, that we were going to have a major pyroclastic flow that took out the main town. No warning of that. But we knew it was kind of an ongoing eruption, but everybody felt relatively safe, I would say, because of precautions. Mm-hmm. And the reason I thought it had been eruption was I heard a noise, and I thought it was a boat, and there was no boat that went overhead, right. And so I thought something strange is going on. I was probably about 500 meters from the shore.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
really
you were
close.
just underwater and everything just went black, basically?
10 meters, 30 feet underwater.
Wow.
And I was photographing the reef, and I thought, something's wrong with my camera. I'm not getting enough light to take the picture. And I looked at my camera, and then I looked up, and all this ash was coming down. It was getting darker and darker. And then it turned pitch black. Pitch black. Yeah.
Wow. I can't even imagine. I think I would think the world was ending.
So as somebody who has spent a lot of time underwater, like the one thing that is always drilled into your head and that I drill into my students' head when I'm teaching them is be calm, right? Don't panic, because panic is the very first thing that's going to get you in trouble. Was there a moment where you were like, I have to stay calm? Or like, what was your immediate emotional reaction to just kind of the light disappearing as you start to see this ash drifting down through the water?
So I'm a scientist. My first reaction is my equipment is failing. And the second reaction was, so I had a team member and a local person we were training in diving and monitoring with me. So my next reaction was, I think there's been an eruption. It's the only thing that would account for what's happening. And I'm going to go to the surface and see what's happening. And so I said, I'm going up, signal for that. And I motioned to them to stay, but they were not staying. They were hanging on to me. And so I literally went up, and I didn't panic. And I think this is being a scientist, actually, because you're so interested almost and in tune with what's happening in nature. So I didn't panic. I just looked at it and thought, okay, we're still here. This is happening. And then I said, okay, I'm going to go back down and put out our sediment traps, because we're going to get some extraordinary information about reef structure from this. So I did. I went down and put out some sediment traps, and then came back up, and I picked up our equipment because our equipment was underwater as well. Then came back up, and because I'd been going to that site so often, I knew exactly where the boat was. So we couldn't see at that point, but I knew instinctively which direction to go, and got back to the boat, and we had to go through the burning vegetation. We got back to the boat. It had about 4 or 6 inches of ash at that time. So we then got on the boat, started the engines. I had 2 engines, one cut out. Fortunately, the other stayed working. And then, so the ash was blowing east to west. And then we went north to get out of it, and spent about the next 4 to 5 hours out in the ocean, really just watching with incredible sadness what we were seeing, but also before we felt it was safe to come back. Because we didn't know. We didn't have cell phones. We had walkie-talkies, but there was no one answering. So we just stayed and waited.
I think it would be really easy in that situation to look at that and feel, maybe angry isn't the right word, but upset or worried. And that could be something that severs or reduces one's connection with nature. But for you, it was different, right? You felt like going through that experience deepened that connection? Yes,
it did, because volcanic eruptions happen. They're not something that happens that regularly, but probably more regularly than we know. It's like hurricanes happen. And it is understanding that this is part of our natural world. And what I see as a scientist is how ecosystems cope with these kind of events, because they happen in ecosystems. And ecosystems have a way of being resilient. Some species do well in some events, some don't. But fundamentally, the very fast-growing corals are most affected by ash and eruptions. The slow-growing corals, when these ones, the fast-growing ones, are affected by eruptions, start to grow up. And that response creates the biodiversity. So for me, these events, it did deepen my relationship, because I learned how ecosystems respond. I learned how species respond. From a human perspective, it was incredibly sad, because people lost their lives. A culture was destroyed in terms of the main town. And then it became, the next part was, how do you help to rebuild that culture and rebuild that relationship with nature that has been there, and that dependence on nature? And that's where we ended up moving the coral reef. So that becomes really important.
And I kind of want to echo what Chance said, is like, you have kind of been beat up by nature a few times. Not only was there this volcanic eruption, but you also had a flight get blown off the runway during takeoff because of a hurricane. And like, to come back and be like, no, this deepens my connection with nature and how powerful it is, I think is really powerful in itself. Because like Chance said, I think it could be easy to be angry that this has happened to me, and like, this is terrible and why is this happening? But for you to turn that around and be like, no, that just makes me have an even deeper connection. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I think nature for me was healing. In the case you're talking about the plane crash, I was coming back actually from a Coral Reef conference, and we were taking off from Taiwan in a hurricane. Why we were taking off in a hurricane, who knows?
Because maybe it'll work.
Yes, but our plane turned down the wrong runway, and then I think the pilot recognized it was a construction site actually, and tried to take off. And so as we took off, he hit the site and pierced the fuel tanks, so the plane blew up.
Oh my gosh.
And so I was very, very fortunate to survive. I ended up being in the plane crash, being in the plane that was on fire, covered in jet fuel, and found a way out. I'm very fortunate to be here. But it was traumatic. I mean, let's be honest, it was horrific and traumatic and extremely violent. And the next day, I was in a hotel room because it was a natural disaster and a disaster. And there was a lot of confusion as to where people were and how to get people out. But I was aware of how I felt and that I was not in the best of shape, shall we say. And so I filled up the bathtub, and I got in the bathtub and put my head underwater. And I imagined myself back on a coral reef that I had been on the day before, snorkeling with a sea turtle that had come up to join me and over this extraordinarily beautiful reef. And I mentally put myself in that space, and I felt fine. And during the next few days, when a lot of the trauma and I couldn't sleep came up, I would go back mentally to nature. And then afterwards, when I got back home, I was out in the Caribbean, and I went to the Caribbean in order that I could get back in the water, spend time with nature, process what had happened, and realign myself, really. And so nature is a great healer.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful that even if there are times that you can't be in nature, maybe you can't be in the water, go on a hike where you are, you can kind of almost enter like this meditative space and think about those times you have been in nature, and that can still bring calm to you. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, and we can all do that. We can all access that. And that's the beauty of it. I mean, things happen to people. They do. I wouldn't advise, I hope no one goes through a plane crash. It's awful. But things happen in life. And having your support system, and nature can give you a resilience, a personal resilience. I think it can bring economic and community resilience too, but it is always there. And I think we saw it in the pandemic as well. People did go back in nature. People got connected because, lizards and birds and stuff started coming back in the house because they felt safe to do that.
Yeah.
Because our sound went down. Yeah.
We've spent a fair amount of time so far talking about having a personal connection with nature. And I want to hear a little bit about your thoughts on, as an entrepreneur, how we can bring nature into the economic space and like what we can learn from nature and what the work is that you're trying to do kind of in that world.
Yeah, I think, and that's a great question, because one of the things for me, I thought, okay, I have a personal relationship with nature, but how do you, we talk about scale, how do you scale that up to make it more important in the real world, in the larger world? And so let's talk about the economics and almost the business case for nature. I hate to use that phrase, but in essence, it's that. Right now, our model is that we have an economic structure and that nature is a nice to have. When you see developments happen, often the first thing they do is level the landscape and then re-landscape it. But what I see and what is getting more and more proven and demonstrated is that if we take nature into account, it actually has a lower cost, a return on investment, and that matters, and it creates jobs. And all of these matter to people, they matter to communities, and they matter to investors and people who think profit before anything else. Let's be blunt, that exists in the world. So let me give you an example, I think, rather than just trying to sound abstract. As an example, what we found is that dunes, coral reefs, mangroves can protect coastal communities. They keep sand on the beach, they reduce storm surge, they make places beautiful. That in turn translates into property values going up. And there was a study came out by an organization that looked at property values in relation to being next to nature reserves and parks. And property values are about 20% higher in these areas because they're beautiful. So there's a direct effect on that. The other is that it creates areas that are more resilient against climate change. So we can now quantify that. So it's not just a nice to have, but there are ways of saying what kind of performance values will you get from having wetlands that filter water, that act as water purifiers, that reduce how much you have to spend on treating water and your storm drainage systems. All of these have direct benefits for communities and investment. And so that's what I mean. It fits in the pro forma, the business pro forma model. We just don't do it yet. And then the other thing it does is creates jobs. It creates jobs in stewardships of land. It creates jobs in, let's say, for example, we are going to create a mangrove habitat for managing storm surge, for water purification, for managing flooding. Then we need somebody who is going to create that mangrove nursery, manage those mangroves, create the amenity, and that turns out to give a different kind of job in the community. And that is basically, it's beneficial, but it also is a return to whoever does that.
I think that's something we've been seeing more and more of over the years is value put into nature in like an economic way, right? Nature really should be inherently valuable, but in the way we live today, you kind of have to say, well, it's economically valuable this way too. And I think seeing it with like insurance companies being like, okay, you have a reef and these sand dunes to break some of this storm surge. I feel like we're seeing more and more of that, and more companies, investors get on board with like, oh yeah, I guess we should protect nature because it's helpful and it's going to bring us more money. And at the end of the day, it's kind of hard that some people think that way, but I feel like whatever gets them to the point that they are willing to protect nature is good enough.
And I think you make a very important point in saying that. For me, when I started off as a scientist and an ecologist, I felt like if I showed people the importance of nature, if I showed people the data, they would get on board. And then that was perhaps naive, but I didn't think so at the time. But then I began to see that people have a very different set of priorities and values. And you have to respect those priorities and values because often they do bring something to the world. They're just different to mine or different to others. But being able to communicate with people on their priorities and values brings them into the conversation. And then being able to say, look, I know that it's really important to you to create jobs and to get a return on investment, and that high return on investment is important to you. That's just fine. But let me show you a way that you can achieve that and do good in the world, do good in the environment, and actually save yourself money. Because we look at how nature-based solutions like coral reefs are 15 times on average less expensive than building a seawall, and they last better. So there's a direct economic benefit there. And when you explain that to people who see nature through a different set of lenses and it makes sense, more often than not they start to do it. And then when they do it, something magical happens. They start to connect with the nature and the environment that they're helping to benefit. And then before you know it, they're telling other people about the importance of nature and they're telling their peers. And that's a great way to spread the message.
I think a love for nature really grows like a vine. It just starts out small, and it takes just having the right conditions for that seed to germinate. And once it's up and running, it really grows and kind of entwines itself into how you see the world as a whole. And it's really just about meeting people where they are so that we can get those seeds germinated and have them start to grow. And then nature's pretty good about maintaining that herself, about just really coming back to people and demonstrating her value to people who are willing to see it.
Yes, and that's such a very beautiful description of it. That's wonderful. That's exactly it. Just that vine growing, that captures it so well.
Thank you very much.
What makes you hopeful for the future, whether it's specifically with OceanShot or the other work that you're doing? What gives you hope that we're headed in the right direction?
Two main things. One, I do see that we're making a difference. I do see that across the world, like renewable energies are increasing. There's more attention to nature. There's broader attention to nature. We don't report on it as often as we should. But these changes are happening and the discussions are changing. there's no longer like, is climate change real? It's more like, what do we do about it? The argument is what to do, not if it's happening. And not so long ago, the argument was, is it happening? I think the first is that I'm seeing progress. The second is I'm looking at the generation coming after me, people like you. And when I started off, the ocean was too big to fail. There was really no discussion on sustainability. And then it became almost something as a fringe effort. And now I see that generations coming up are taking for granted that sustainability is something we have to achieve, taking for granted that the environment is important, taking for granted that inclusiveness is important. And some of the innovations that are happening, some of the ideas that are happening, some of the actions that people are taking are absolutely inspiring. They get me up in the morning and I learn so much. So I feel like our planet with the generation coming up is in great shape, in great hands. And that really, really inspires me.
I love that.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. Well, this has been such an inspiring conversation for me personally to get to sit down and talk with you about this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm glad you enjoyed it. This was really been a treat for us.
Oh, it has been for me too. Thank you for what you do and for getting the message out. This is so important.
It is so on brand for a scientist to go through like a life-changing catastrophic event and have one of their first thoughts be, let me get my sediment traps.
Yeah, that was crazy to be like, oh my gosh, like there's ash falling from the sky. Everything's going dark. Our boat's getting covered in ash. We need to get out of here. Oh, but first let me go pick up the stuff I left down on the ocean floor and put out these traps so we can like monitor everything later.
A true scientist.
Yeah, that's crazy. And just a remarkable and terrible event and story that she experienced in a place that we've actually seen. When we were on Antigua, we looked across to the island across from us, and that was the island in this story, which we didn't realize at the time.
I had actually forgotten that until this moment.
Yeah. But to hear her story and her experience of how these natural disasters strengthened her relationship with nature, I say it in the episode, but I'll say it again, I think is very powerful and very telling of the kind of person she is and the work that she's passionate about.
Definitely an inspiration. So next week, November 26th, is our last episode of season 11. We'll be back in mid-January with new episodes, season 12.
So we're looking forward to that. We hope that you are looking forward to that as well. We'll be changing some things up, so even more to look forward to. In the meantime, you can text us on the hotline. If you want a free sticker pack, you can let us know how you found the show, that you left a review for the show, or that you've told your friends about it.
That number is 706-505-0582. Shoot me a text. I want to talk with you.
We are a nonprofit, so if you would like to donate to our nonprofit, you can go to our website in the show notes, conservationconnection.co. You can also check out our shop on our website to support us, or you can just leave a review for our show. It's so helpful in getting the show out there to more people who are interested in these topics.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.